Live from the chicken wing capital of the world, Buffalo, New York. You're listening to the Childcare Bridge podcast, your source for the best tips, tools, and tactics on how to market and grow your childcare center, ensuring total domination. Total domination. This is the Childcare Bridge, and this is your host, Michael Tasner.
Hey there, and welcome to this week's episode of the Childcare Bridge. Today's topic is about getting back into the weeds on math. I've had probably a dozen strategy calls over the last few weeks, and the calls are insanely interesting to me due to the fact that a lot of childcare center owners do not know their numbers. When I ask them even simple questions, like, how much money did you make last year? How many full-time equivalent enrollments do you have? How long are families staying with you? Are they staying for 3 months, 10 months, 4 years? Some of the most basic questions, it kind of throws them into a tailspin. So I wanted to do, and I've done this before, I've talked about marketing math, but I wanted to do another episode just kind of talking through how I like to think about data and how I could argue that it's the most important piece at running your center. It's the equivalent of you getting into a car and putting a blindfold on and trying to drive if you don't have those numbers. And I can give you the exact same line of thinking. I can give you the exact same challenges that I personally have had when I don't have certain numbers at my fingertips. I start getting antsy. I start asking, like, why don't I have this number? Where is that? Why is that not updated in 3 weeks or 3 months or a week or whatever the timeline is? And it makes it very, very challenging to figure out where to invest your time. Do you jump over here? Do you go and put some resources over there? Like, where do you focus? WTF, where is the focus? Where's the focus? So if I look at marketing as one of those first levers of monitoring data, I want to give you a couple of metrics that you should be looking at every single week. Every single week. And when you're looking at either adding a classroom, you're looking at buying another location, adding a location, I want you to come back to this podcast. I want you to come back to this and start to rationalize out your decisions and see, does the data pass the test? Does it start to line up? So for example, we just looked at childcare center that had extremely, extremely low tuition. So full-time equivalency, and I know it varies by age, but the average tuition was $506 a month. That was the average. So some were a little higher, some were a little bit lower. So let's round it and say 500. And we were starting to look at all of the ratios. So what does this classroom look like? How many teachers do you currently have? Can we move some around? So the goal obviously is to maximize ratios so that you don't have 6 kids in a room with 2 teachers, for example, when you could have 12 kids in that room or 10 kids. Like, it's all about maximizing those ratios. But what they didn't look at was how much their labor cost was growing and how slow they were raising tuition. So they couldn't figure out last year why they lost almost $130,000. And that was without making a bunch of other capital improvements. Thankfully, they had a little bit of grant money. They had some emergency money that they were able to pull from, but you're not running this business to lose money. That's not the point. But if I go 5 or 6 steps back, we really started looking at the marketing process, and we were saying, okay, great. Well, you right now can only handle 10 more enrollments, and you need these ages. And again, your average tuition was $506, I believe. Let's just use 500 so the math doesn't throw me off. So as of right now, they have the ability to add $5,000 a month of top line revenue. Now, the good thing was they had the ability to absorb all of that revenue and not have to hire any additional teachers. But when they started kind of looking around and digging deeper, they realized, well, this classroom hasn't been used in a while. That was like a storage room. So all of a sudden, well, now they can take on 20 enrollments, and they might need to add one other teacher. And the story starts to kind of get a little bit wider. The plot starts to thicken once you kind of start going on that fishing expedition. But the challenge after those first 10 was that while it would plug the hole and it would start to slow down the water that's coming out of this boat, I told you they lost almost $150,000 last year. Now, let's just say that everything is exactly the same this year, except for adding those 10 enrollments. Well, we only ended up adding $60,000 in revenue. And then that was also not factoring in any marketing budget. So I started looking at, okay, great. What can you afford to invest to get those enrollments? I'm all about how much can we buy an enrollment for? Can we buy it for $1,000, $500, $3,000 if we know they're staying for X amount of time? And I'll circle back to that in just a minute. So I said, okay, great. Well, even at, let's call it $1,500 a month, $18,000 a year, to gain $50,000 in revenue, that's some good math, and that's a nice ROI. It's not a huge ROI, but that, again, starts to plug the hole a little bit. But that ends up meaning that, great, we got $30,000 closer. So then when I paused the marketing and then we started digging deeper into the financials and started to realize that, again, labor rates, pretty much every center we're working with, labor rates are going up. How much you have to pay to get good help. Food prices are going up. Just everything is going up. And then we plotted a line and looked at like rising prices against tuition increases. And they were essentially, they weren't inverted, but it was pretty black and white when you have one chart going sky high, all the way up, and that's the costs kind of going up year after year after year, month over month. And the tuition increases were less than 4% over 3 years in total. And when you're talking 4% on $500, we're talking small numbers. So the interesting thing in starting to dissect the data was they thought they had strictly an enrollment issue. Hey, if we had more enrollments, it would solve everything. But unfortunately, it wouldn't solve it. Again, it would slow down the bleeding, but we then still had to make up over $100,000. So what did we do? How I approached this? I could have said, no, we can't help you and best of luck, but then they're going to end up being another one of those metrics. So we did a few different things. The first thing that we did was we increased the tuition by $50. You might say, well, geez, that's a 10% increase, 100%. And the letter was perfectly written, because we wrote it from a marketing standpoint. But it was all about talking about all the good that they've done within the community. They haven't raised anything in many years, and they didn't come out and say, hey, we're bleeding cash here. But they said, unfortunately, the model is not sustainable. And if we don't start to raise our tuition immediately, we won't be able to operate past this year. So the nice thing is, right out of the gate, 100 enrollments, $50 more. So that was the first thing. And if you do the math on that, that math starts to get quite nice and it starts to trickle. And yeah, it's not a huge amount of money, but now we've plugged $5,000 a month and we didn't have to do anything else other than send a letter. I think they lost one enrollment and that family was probably going to leave anyways. So lost one enrollment. All right, so now we raised the tuition, and in the letter, we also said this will not be the only tuition increase this year. We will be doing one more tuition raise in 6 months, so we'll give you plenty of time to prepare, and that would be another $50 increase. So going from 506 to, or I don't have the exact numbers, but they're essentially going from $500 to $600 a month. But now you have literally added $100,000 a year to your top line and essentially your bottom line outside of any taxes, but they were losing money, so they weren't paying any additional taxes outside of payroll taxes. So that is always the first thing that I look at doing is, can we raise the tuition and not have all heck break loose? And I did a podcast all about pricing your programs and what should they be and how do you think about this. I have rarely ever seen a program that is priced perfectly. You could argue, well, our pricing is perfect. Could be. However, when I start to look at what will the market bear, who are you serving, what does your avatar look like, how many centers are in the area, what's the demand, there's a lot of factors that can figure out what the market will actually bear. And until you start testing out different investments for enrollment, you don't necessarily know the answer. We could have tested and sent a letter saying your tuition's going from $500 to $700, and potentially there wouldn't have been a lot of backlash. Now, they are in a very, very low income area, so that kind of raise, a $200 raise, is pretty steep. Yes, some people weren't happy. However, they also knew that the closest childcare center was charging almost $750 a month. So this center is still drastically undercharging. So that is always the first thing that I like to look at is there some meat on the bone to raise tuition? And I personally, if your tuition is really, really low and you haven't adjusted it in a while, I will let the people know that there's going to be 2 raises this year. We're doing one effective in 30 days, one in 6 months, rather than doing this all at once. And then here are all the extra things you're getting and a reminder of all the amazing things you are getting and reminder of how you're still paying an amazing rate. So that started to plug the hole very, very rapidly. And they were able to then start to float things. And then in tandem, we started looking at all of that marketing data and the ratios and looking at, great, we could add 6 more pre-K families here. We had spots for 2 infants, which usually there's never any spots for infants at any centers that we work with. We had another classroom that had a couple of extra 2s and 3s. And then they ended up but they ended up having another spot where they could add another 10, 12 families or students with only having to add 1 teacher after they started moving things around. They were using it as like storage, and it just wasn't a well-utilized space. When you're in the game of care, you have to look at utilizing all the space that you have. Not saying you're putting kids and you're teaching out of closets, but there's a lot of centers that I've walked through. I'm like, hey, what's this space used for? Oh, it's just storage, or we've got a bunch of boxes piled up, or overflow. Saying, well, this is a classroom. Why is this not being used? And it's just one of those things that you kind of get comfortable doing things the same way. So you need to make sure that from a financial standpoint, from a data standpoint, that you've got these numbers. You know what your ratios look like compared to how many kids you have, so that when you're working with a marketing agency like ours, you can say, hey, we need more 2s and 3s. Hey, we need more preschool aged. We need more infants. That'll help maximize the ratios and keep the profitability a bit higher. You also really need to be looking at that tuition to see as you're investing in marketing. So I was talking to another center when we ran the math. I had to say, there's just no way we can help you. And I hate saying that because we really do try to help every center regardless of size. But I mean, they would have been lucky to be able to invest $300 a month in marketing, because the way that they were charging, how much they were paying their team, the lease, all the other costs, insurance, like they were very, very close to a break even. And as you started adding on more enrollments, they just didn't have things dialed in, that sometimes you have to take a step back. You have to look at things from a very different perspective. And I've done that at my business as well many, many times, where I take a few steps back and like I don't see what I don't see at times. Like I know there's a bunch of different phrases, but what is it? Like if you're in the clouds, you won't see the weeds, or the other way around. Like there's data and things like that you might not be seeing. But from a marketing standpoint, I want you to know how many leads are coming in, how many tours are you doing, how is your conversion? On the financial side, what is your top line? How is your ratios looking, your ratio maximization? How's your bottom line looking? How is your labor cost looking? And there's a lot of those data points that you want to be looking at. But I highly encourage you, as step 1, take a look at your tuition and see, can even a small increase, because I am hearing, seeing, feeling day in and day out a lot of uncertainty in the industry right now. more than I have in the 10 years in working in it, of can we make this work? This is a service that is needed. People need childcare. But you also, as the owner, need to make sure that you're earning a comfortable living, that you can pay for things for your family, that you can take time off. And you do that by knowing your numbers, charging the right amount of tuition, and really keeping an eye on those numbers each week, and then course correcting. Get in sync on your numbers, know your numbers, so you can change course as needed. As always, thank you for tuning in. Michael Tasner signing off. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night. See you next week.